Most people hate math, and I get it. But there's 5 simple formulas you need to understand if you want to make and save serious money. And yes, this is mostly a tech channel, but as someone that has worked as a software engineer in fintech for 7 years, it's only right that I throw in a little money math. Formula number one is actually two formulas: the average daily balance method and the daily balance method. These are the two main formulas that credit card issuers will use to calculate your interest at the end of the month. A lot of people think that the interest that they owe is based on their remaining balance at the end of the billing cycle, but that's actually not the case. And you could be paying way more in interest than you need to be. Now, ideally, you would just pay off your credit card in full every month and avoid carrying a balance so you don't accrue any interest. But with housing, groceries, and everyday items at an all-time high, paying off debt has been harder than ever. According to Bankrate, as of June 2024, half of US credit card holders carry a balance month to month. So if you're in this situation, understanding how these formulas work could help you chip away at your debt much faster. Here's how they work. Say your credit card has an APR or annual percentage rate of 20%. Even though the credit card issuer gives you the annual rate, they're actually more concerned with how much you spend daily rather than annually. Because of that, they'll determine two things. First, your daily periodic rate. They do this by dividing your APR by 365 days of the year. For a 20% APR, that's 0.055% per day. Then they determine your daily balance. That's exactly as it sounds. It's how much your balance is at the end of the day after any new charges, fees, or payments were made to your account. According to TransUnion, the average credit card balance in the US is $6,000. So say you start the month off with a balance of $6,000. You like to collect credit card points, so every month you put all the bills and expenses that you can on your credit card and pay them off before the end of the billing cycle. So on day 3, you pay all your monthly bills and expenses for the month, which comes out to $2,000. That $2,000 is now added to your balance, and now your balance becomes $8,000. Your balance remains $8,000 until day 30, the last day of the billing cycle. But on that last day, you decide to pay off that extra $2,000 you spent so that you don't have to pay interest on it at the end of the month. At least you might have assumed that, but you actually are still required to pay interest on that extra $2,000 for all the days that it sat on your balance. If your credit card uses the average daily balance method to calculate your interest, the issuer will first get the average of your daily balances by adding up all the daily balances and dividing it by the number of days of that billing cycle. Then they multiply that by the daily periodic rate and then by the number of days in the billing cycle. That means you would owe around $129 in interest at the end of the month. But what if you instead paid off that $2,000 charge the day you made it so that your daily balance remains at $6,000 for the entire billing cycle? Then your interest would only be $99. So even though you paid off that extra $2,000 before the billing cycle, you still have to pay an extra $30 that month just for having it on your balance for 27 days. If your credit card uses the daily balance method, the issuer calculates your interest a little differently, but you still get similar results. By the way, if you're curious to see if your credit card uses the daily balance method or the average daily balance method, you can check the cardholder agreement. I checked a few online and found some American Express, Wells Fargo, and Bank of America credit cards that use the average daily balance method, and some Citi, Chase, and Discover credit cards that use the daily balance method. With the daily balance method, that means your credit card balance is compounded daily. That means every day your balance is accruing interest, and then that interest is added to the daily balance to be used for the next day. Let me show you how that would work with the same example. If you started the first day of the month or billing cycle at $6,000 and made no transactions or payments that day, your interest would be your daily balance of $6,000 times the daily periodic rate of 0.055%. So your ending balance for that day becomes $6,003.30. So on day 2, your beginning balance is now $6,003.30. And with no additional transactions or payments that day, your ending balance again becomes the beginning balance plus the interest on the beginning balance, which brings it to $6,006.60. But on day 3, you have $2,000 worth of charges. So you add that to the beginning balance to get a total of $8,006.60. And then you calculate the interest on this new balance so that the final daily balance becomes $8,011.01. If we calculate the rest of the balances through the end of the month, the sum of the interest fees is what you will owe at the end of the billing cycle. So there isn't a huge difference between these two methods as far as how much interest you'll pay at the end of the month. But in both cases, you're still paying interest on charges that you already paid off. And if your objective of paying with a credit card is to collect points, then you're not getting much, if any, value from the points because the extra money that you're spending in interest usually costs more than the value of the points that you gained. The best way to avoid this is to pay off your credit card in full every month. But the second best way is if you know you're going to carry a balance into the next month and you're also going to make some charges on your credit card, try to pay them off as soon as possible just so you can lower your daily balance. The next formula you need to understand is the future value formula. Even though it's second on this list, I'd argue that it's the most important on this list because not understanding it is what keeps so many people from building a solid retirement fund. The future value formula helps you calculate how much extra money you may gain from investing by factoring in compound interest. Compound interest is what allows money to grow exponentially over time. This is because at some frequency, whether daily, monthly, or annually, the money is increased by some percentage of itself. We saw what daily compounding looks like with the daily balance method. Annual compounding is what you may see when you invest in an index fund that follows the S&P 500. This tracks the performance of 500 leading publicly traded US companies. When you invest in it for 20 to 30 or more years, you can expect roughly a 10% annual return based on historical data. Of course, past performance doesn't guarantee future results, so we can't know exactly what the future returns will be, but we can reasonably predict that the money will be compounded annually at a rate of 10%. And we can therefore use the future value formula to determine how much your money will be worth in 20 years. Say we have $1,000 and we want to see how much it's worth in 20 years if we invest it. We could go the step-by-step route and calculate the interest at the end of each year, where after the first year, the $1,000 would increase by 10% and become $1,100. And after the second year, the $1,100 would increase by 10% and become $1,210, and so on until we get to 20 years. Or we can use the future value formula, where PV is present value, in our case, $1,000. R is the interest rate, or the rate at which it's compounded, so 10% or 0.1 in decimals. T is equal to the number of years, and N is equal to the number of times it's compounded in 1 year. Since it compounds annually, N will also be 1. If we plug in those values, we'll calculate that after 20 years, that $1,000 will turn into $6,727.50. If you were to plug those same values into a future value calculator or a compound interest calculator like this one on NerdWallet, you would see the same exact number. And yes, realistically, you can just find a calculator online instead of doing this math by hand, but what if you get stuck on a remote island and don't have a calculator, don't have any internet, and you need to figure out what your investments are in 20 years from now? I mean, this stuff is useful. But when you're saving for retirement or just trying to build wealth in general by leveraging compound interest, you don't want to just invest once and let your money sit for 20 plus years. You get an even greater benefit if you contribute to your investments regularly. Just by contributing another $100 a year after your initial $1,000 investment, that $6,727 becomes $12,455. If you want to calculate this manually, there is a second part of the future value formula that takes this into account. It looks complicated, but it's just for using values we already know. We know N, R, and T, and the only new value that's added is PMT, which is the amount you would contribute every year. In this example is $100. Let's switch gears to taxes really quick, because the next formula you need to know is how to calculate your ordinary income tax using the graduated rate income tax system. A common misconception that I also believe well after I started working is that if you get a raise and move into a higher tax bracket, then the entirety of your income is now taxed at that bracket. Meaning that if you went from making $47,000 in taxable income, so after any deductions or exemptions, which is in range for the 12% tax rate, to making an extra $500, putting you at $47,500 and in the range for the 22% tax rate, that you would now owe almost double in taxes. But that's not the case. Both in the US and most other countries, we use the graduated rate income tax system. That means you only pay each tax rate on the portion of your taxable income that falls within that bracket. Say you're a single person in the US in 2024, making $47,500 a year in taxable income from your job. The first $11,600 of your income would be taxed at 10%. Then everything from $11,601 to $47,150, so the next $35,550 would be taxed at 12%. Then, since your income falls into the next bracket between $47,151 to $100,525, everything remaining, so your income of $47,500 minus the first $47,150 of income that was already taxed, would be taxed at 22%. That would result in you paying $5,503 in federal taxes, leaving you with around $42,000 before other taxes like your state, local, and Social Security taxes. In this case, 22% is considered your marginal tax rate or your tax bracket, because that's the bracket that your income falls in. But your effective tax rate, which is the actual percentage of your income that goes to federal taxes, is 11.6%. So you'll always take home more money if you make more money. And not only does the amount that you're taxed depend on your filing status, so whether you're single, married, or head of household, it also increases every year to keep up with inflation. The brackets themselves vary per country, but the math is still the same. But if you do live in a country where that's not the case, let us know in the comments. Speaking of taxes, this next formula is less of a formula and more of a life hack to help you owe as little as possible on taxes. Let's go back to our 20-year investment example. When an investment gains additional value, that gain is called capital gain. In our example from earlier, when we invested in the S&P 500, if we subtract the initial investment from how much it would be worth after 20 years, we would get our capital gain. Specifically, if you haven't sold your investment and taken profit on it yet, that's considered unrealized capital gains. Once you do, it's considered realized capital gains. Capital gain applies to anything that your country deems as an investment. So in the US and most other countries, that's stocks, bonds, crypto, real estate, and a few others. Unlike the income you receive from working a job, which is considered earned income, capital gains is considered investment income. But both earned income and investment income are considered taxable income. In the US, there's two main types of capital gains: short-term capital gains and long-term capital gains. Say you're a single person in the US and invested $10,000 at the beginning of the year, but by the end of the year, the price increased to $15,000. So you want to cash out. Your capital gain is $5,000. And because you cashed out in less than a year, you have to pay short-term capital gains tax on that $5,000. For short-term capital gains, the US always treats it as earned income from a tax perspective. That means you would pay ordinary income tax on it. So if you made $60,000 in taxable income from your job, that extra $5,000 in short-term capital gains will be added to that number. So it would be equivalent to you making $65,000 in taxable income from your job. The government would use a graduated tax system to determine how much you owe in taxes, which would result in $9,353 in taxes. But long-term capital gains is where the real life hack is. Say you waited until after a year passed to cash out on your $5,000. Again, you made $60,000 in taxable income from your job, but because you waited a year, that $5,000 is now considered long-term capital gains and is taxed differently. That $60,000 is taxed at the ordinary tax rate, which leaves you with $8,253 in ordinary taxes. But long-term capital gains tax rates follow a different system. Long-term capital gains taxes have three brackets at 0, 15, and 20%. For capital gains, your entire taxable income is used to determine your tax rate, but the tax itself only applies to the capital gains. In this example, since you made $65,000 in taxable income as a single person, you would pay a 15% tax rate on your capital gains. Here's why. When determining your capital gains tax rate, you first take your earned income into account, and then stack your capital gains income on top of that. The first bracket has a 0% capital gains tax on the first $47,025. If your taxable income at that level was capital gains income, you would apply that 0%. But since it's earned income, we can ignore it and move to the next bracket, since your earned income is already taxed at the ordinary tax rate. At this next bracket, with a rate of 15%, you have your remaining earned income and your capital gains income stacked on top of it. Again, your earned income is already taxed, so we can ignore it. But that leaves the rest of your taxable income, which does happen to be capital gains, to be taxed at 15%. So after paying the $8,253 in ordinary taxes and 15% of the $5,000 in capital gains at $750, you would owe $9,003, which is $350 less than you would pay with short-term capital gains tax. But now say you made $65,000 in long-term capital gains and no earned income for the year. If we recreate our taxable income stack again, you'll see that because we lowered our earned income, part of our capital gains income now falls in that 0% bracket. That means you owe 0% on the first $47,025 and 15% only on the remaining $17,975, which means for a $65,000 capital gain, you only pay $2,696 in taxes. So to sum it up, when you pay taxes on a $65,000 income that you earned from a job and or short-term capital gains, you pay $9,353. But when you pay taxes on $65,000 in capital gains income, you only pay $2,696. This is the strategy wealthy people use to pay less taxes. Or how some CEOs will pay less in taxes but make more than their employees. Because they'll take a low salary, but they'll also have stock in the company that they can sell at long-term capital gains rates. So the key to real wealth is to turn your earned income into investment income. And just two quick notes. One, even if you only have capital gains income, you can still apply the standard deduction or any other deductions to lower your taxable income even more. And two, regarding investment accounts, these don't include your typical tax advantage accounts like your traditional 401k or IRA. That's because you already invested the money untaxed, and therefore the government is expecting you to pay the ordinary tax rate when you're ready to withdraw it. But these accounts do have their own tax benefit, like lowering your taxable income. The last formula is a formula that you've probably used a lot without realizing there's a name for it. It's called the cost per use formula, and it's exactly as the name suggests. For instance, if you get a gym membership that's $40 a month and you plan to go 3 times a week, so 12 times a month, that means you're paying $3.33 every time you go to the gym. On the other hand, if your membership is $120 a month, that's $10 each time you go. Now, say you make $10 an hour. $3.33 for an hour at the gym may seem reasonable, but $10 for an hour at the gym may not, given that it's equivalent to an hour of you working. The cost per use formula is a good way to determine if something is worth the cost because you can look at it from a day-by-day perspective. It wouldn't be as obvious of looking at the price difference between the $40 a month and the $120 a month of what the immediate trade-off would be. This can be used for determining if you should rent or buy something as well. And I'm not talking about housing because that's a whole nother beast. But smaller things like renting or buying a lawnmower or a camera or furniture, or even maybe buying versus leasing a car. But it will always cost you $0 to subscribe to this channel. If you enjoyed this, check out this next video where I explain how the microchip in your credit card works.